Welcome to A Night for Truth, conversations with Dr. Alice von Hildebrand on the work of her husband, Dietrich von Hildebrand, the great 20th century Roman Catholic philosopher and theologian. We've been talking in our former conversations principally about his great work, Transformation in Christ. I'm Tom Howard. I have been an avid reader of Dietrich von Hildebrand's work for a number of years, long before I met Dr. von Hildebrand, his wife, and I must confess that this is a book which I suspect I will be reading for the rest of my life, as long as I'm here in this mortal coil. We have recently been talking of his remarks on humility, and there are a number of interesting paradoxes in this question of humility. Humility is not a low view of ourselves. It has very little to do with a sort of a cringing, fawning, obsequious attitude. That would be a false humility. And actually, paradoxically, it is true humility, which is almost a precondition to our understanding and coming to terms with our authentic dignity, even we might say majesty, as creatures of God. You know, the great mistake that Satan made at the beginning was to be dissatisfied with his role. It was an unbelievably glorious role, but he didn't want to be creature. He says, I will ascend up, I will set up my throne next to the Most High. Adam and Eve, the same thing. They were lured by the appeal of Satan's promising them that they would be like gods. They were dissatisfied with the conditions of being human, forgetting that to be human is to belong to the most august species of creature in the universe. There's an odd sense, of course, in which we, men and women, belong to a species which bears a twofold dignity that no other creature bears, even the cherubim and the seraphim, because it is said of us that we are made in the image of God. That is not said of the angels. And also, of course, we wear the flesh worn by God at his incarnation. So there is a marvelous paradox here where, on the one hand, or shall we say simultaneously, there's a profound humility which goes along with a clear view of what we are. We are creatures, and yet that creatureliness, rather than godness, we're not gods, is the very badge of our dignity. Lily, what particular emphases would you bring out from your husband's chapter here on?
You know, you made a remark about angels, and I would not dare, I'm not a theologian, but I like to think that they too are made to God's image and likeness. But St. Augustine says something which is, to my mind, extremely revealing. He says, it is true indeed that angels are placed above us, but what gives man an extraordinary dignity and greatness is that Christ became God and not an angel. And that gives, so to speak, human being an extraordinary dignity, which is precisely, as you said very beautifully, something that one acknowledges in humility. It is not a cringing attitude, you know, in which you sort of despise yourself. But one thing must be said and said again and again. It's a virtue that cannot develop except in a personal confrontation with the one true God. You see, if I compare myself, and we do that constantly, you don't like your face. But then you meet someone and you say, well, after all, man is not that bad. I would not like to have the face of such and such. or you find yourself too tall, or too short, or too fat, or too thin, and so on and so on. And you will always find someone who is worse off, and you can console yourself. So you find something, well, I'm not a genius, and we are a genius, but I'm not as stupid as so-and-so. The very moment that you abandon these categories and you stand naked in front of the all-supreme, all-powerful, holy God, in this very moment, you have a possibility of learning humility.
Your husband says, you quoted virtually verbatim this sentence here, it is only in our confrontation with a personal God that we become fully aware of our condition as creatures and fling from us the last particle of self-glory.
You know, you're perfectly right. When I do say something which is correct, you can be absolutely certain that I've taken it from him. But what is interesting is that this notion of Christian humility has been so eroded in the world in which we live. Not very long ago, in a Catholic magazine, rather famous Catholic magazine, there was an article written by a Protestant about a Christian university. And one of the things that he said was that he knew atheists that were much more humble than Christians, you know, which I immediately challenged in a letter to the editor and simply saying, you know, he's speaking about modesty. He's not speaking about humility, because unless you take God as your measure, you cannot possibly understand what humility is. And there comes one of my beloved Christian paradoxes, because Christianity is full of paradoxes. And as Chesterton has shown, paradoxes are not contradictions. A truth is so full of content that you need two complementary formulations in order to formulate this truth. I mean, for example, you take the fact that the Holy Virgin says, de posuit potentes de sede et exaltavit humiles. When you translate that.
Put down the mighty from their seat and has exalted the humble and meek.
Yes, and the very next moment you're going to find out that someone who has 10 talents receives 10 more, and the one who has only one is going to lose the only one that he received. So there you have some sort of mysterious paradox. You have the immense greatness and majesty of God. You know, one of the things which is so, heaven and earth cannot contain him because he's so great and so transcendent. And the next moment you are told he's in the womb of a woman. You know, the whole universe cannot contain, and therefore the most fragile, the weakest thing that you can imagine, the child in the womb. And Christ himself was in the womb. So once again you have one of these amazing paradoxes. And one of the paradoxes of humility, you know, something that appeals to me very particularly, is that you recognize your nothingness. Saint Catherine of Siena said, "Que tu sia et io non sia," that you may be and I not be, meaning to say, you know, I'm nothing in front of you, I'm just dust and ashes. I mean, Abraham begging God to save Sodom and Gomorrah, and says, how dare I, who am dust and ashes? That's what we are. And at the same time, it is in no way linked to a note of depression. Well, I wish I was something, and so, you know, when you tell someone, well, you know, your work is not that good, well, I know that I was good for nothing anyway. I always said so anyway. Why don't you encourage me to do it? I know that I'm not. And people are despondent or depressed.
And there's a sense in which a false humility, which is really a form of pride, is everlastingly calling attention to itself. Oh, poor me. Oh, little me. Oh, I'm not this. I'm not that. I can't do this and I can't do that. Whereas an authentic humility, which issues, as your husband says, from a confrontation with the personal God, it is the precondition, it seems to me, of authentic human dignity. I think your husband was a case in point of this, even though I've never met him, but I've read about him and I've seen pictures of him, and in his very face, you can see almost the icon of a man who has soberly and massively understood what it is to be man, to be created in the image of God, and yet a man who is absolutely at home on his knees.
That's
not groveling.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. And, it's a thought that my husband has expressed several times in his works when he's comparing pantheism to Christianity. Because if you take pantheism, the idea basically that everything is God, and therefore I'm part of this immense reality, whatever it is, which is God. And he says it is very strange that it is couched in humble terms. I'm only a particle in this immense whole, and simultaneously this tremendous pride, well, I'm God. Years ago, and this is one of my very, very cherished experiences in Hunter, because Hunter is a melting pot, and I believe that through my career I must have had students from 32 or 35 different nationalities, coming from Asia and coming from Africa, coming South America, all over the world, in fact.
Dr. von Hildebrand is speaking of Hunter College in Manhattan Island, where
City University,
used to be
New York,
CCNY,
yes. And CUNY, City University of New York, yes.
UNY.
And at any rate, I had a girl from India with a beautiful sari. It's a very beautiful, noble face, and she was taking my course, Philosophy of Religion. And she seemed to be quite fascinated. She listened to every word I said with the keenest possible interest. And one day she raised her hand and she said, Professor Rodin, I truly do not know whether I understood you rightly, but you seem to say that God exists independently of us. And I said, well, I'm glad to say that I made my point clear. That's exactly what I said. And then she thought for a moment, with a very noble face, she turned to me and she said, this is something that I cannot endorse. And I said, why not? And then very gracefully, the grace that these people have, and dignity, and she bowed slightly and she says, because I am God. Now just imagine, Tom, you find yourself in the classroom and you find out that right in front of you, one of your students is God. It's a rather uncomfortable situation, you see. And she said so, as a matter of course. And then I had a rather strange, elderly Irish student, he was a maverick, and he said, what did you say? And then she bowed to him and she said, I'm God. And then he hit his forehead, he says, Father, you are God. No, what was interesting about it?
Little Irish realism.
There was a certain of dignified haughtiness about her. The consciousness, you are God. And even though she was only a parcel of God, obviously she was not the totality of it, but nevertheless, the sort of feeling, well, I'm something in Christianity is the very opposite. I came out of nothing. And I knew when I was a little girl, because, thank God I had a very, very good Catholic education. By the time I was 15, I truly knew my faith. And they say our existence is metaphysically so frail that if God did not constantly hold us in existence, we fall back into nothingness. You say, in other words, there must be this constant work of providence to hold me in existence, because otherwise, from myself, I'm nothing and I fall back into nothing. And what is so amazing is the consciousness that it is so. And the overwhelming joy, which is typical of humble people. They're joyful because they're liberated from themselves and they know the infinitely powerful and good God loves me. You see, and therefore you have this paradox that you cannot think enough about your dignity as an image of God that you share, and that everybody shares, and you cannot think little enough about your own misery.
Wouldn't you say that an aspect of this paradox is that the truly humble person, far from everlastingly beckoning for attention, I'm so humble, I'm so meek, and so on, increasingly, in a sense, forgets himself. He is interested in you, me, whoever he's talking to. I think I'm not sure whether it was George MacDonald or one of the English writers, but was saying that the truly humble man will impress me not so much, I won't so much go away from a visit with him thinking, oh, what a terribly, terribly humble man. I will go away thinking, that man seemed to be wonderfully interested in everything I was saying. He isn't sitting there thinking of himself.
Yes, of turning to others. But I'm so glad that you mentioned false humility, because our nature is so tricky that sometimes under the cover of humility we are actually seeking for compliment. Or, I don't think that I'm very talented, and then you expect the other person to say, no, you're doing pretty well. Or, I don't like my face. How can you say so? I mean, your face is lovely, everybody, and that sort of thing. The humble man is not concentrated on himself. He's concentrated on God, on the truth, and on others. Now, let me make a remark about humility, which I think is very enlightening, because it is taken from the rule of Saint Benedict. As I told you, I read it very frequently. I don't practice it because it's very, very difficult to practice. To love humiliation is something that I have not achieved, and I still hope to do so on my deathbed or something, at the very last moment.
I think people would be interested to know that this comes from about 500 A.D., somewhere along the rule of Saint Benedict.
Well, he was the founder of Western monasticism. He was the very, very first great religious order. Now, at any rate, it is said in the rule. He speaks about the levels of humility, and he says that one of the tests is that you sincerely believe, honestly and sincerely, not in words, but in your very heart, that other people are better than you. And you rejoice about you look for their virtues. And unless you have a mission as, let us say, abbot or superior or spiritual director, you sort of overlook their mistakes, and you loving, except, of course, the cases in which it's hurting someone else and you have to do something. But I mean that you concentrate on what is positive in a person, whereas when you turn to yourself, you do the very opposite, and you concentrate on your weakness, your miseries, your faults, your catalogues of sins ever since you were a child, and you keep meditating, and you truly come to the conclusion, I'm the worst of them. When I started my spiritual life in the most systematic fashion, I was a cradle Catholic, thanks to God's grace and to the very deep piety of my beloved father. I always practiced my faith. But when I met my husband in Great Transformation, that was for me a decisive moment. That was a change of conversion when I started to take spiritual life very, very seriously. And, I recall having enormous difficulties when I read the life of Saint Teresa of Avila, saying, I'm the worst of all sinners. And I kept saying to myself, she cannot be sincere, she cannot be honest, she knows full well she's never committed adultery, she's never committed murder, she's never done this and this and this and this and this, she's always been pious. There was a couple of years when her piety had sort of weakened. I could not understand it. And now I have, even though I still find it difficult to understand, I have a faint inkling. They discover what they are without God's grace. And this is something that they meditate. I mean, if I saw myself in all my misery deprived of God's grace, I'll have to acknowledge myself to be the worst of sinners. On the other hand, when I was in Switzerland years ago, I met a Protestant minister, a Protestant writer. And his one great passion was to write about saints. And I recall my husband and I had lunch with him, and he wanted to convince us that Saint Teresa of Avila was truly the worst sinner that ever existed, worse than Hitler and Stalin, for the very plain reason that she was truthful and that she declared herself to be the worst of sinners. Now,
did you think he had some evidence?
Well, she said so. She said so herself.
Yes, but I mean, did he think he could put his finger on some
just simply the
incident?
fact that she said so and she was truthful. Now, one more thing about, there was a certain primitivity about it that was very, very depressing. But I mean, one thing is it's typical. A humble person likes to take the last seat. There is so much childish pride in us. People are so, I am more important. I should be given the first seat. I should be given precedence. It is said in the rule of Saint Benedict, give one another precedence. always let the other person, so believe yourself to be, and therefore you come to the last seat. And because you come to the last seat, exaltabitur, you are going to be exalted. And if you take the first seat, then you're going to be humbled. You see, and to rejoice, to go as far, as low as possible, and to feel comfortable, absolutely comfortable and happy. That's where I belong. And therefore, St. Benedict says, the monks should always look downward, conscious of their sinfulness, and simultaneously infinitely grateful for the mercy of God. So you have the two things, and you know what always strikes me? I mean, I spent 10 days at a new convent, Mother Assumpta Long, in Michigan last year, and there were 16 young novices. And the thing that struck me, obviously, they're being trained in humility, because one of the things that happens when you enter a convent is that your superior or your spiritual director makes a point of humbling you. This belongs to the fare of convent life. And what always struck me, and I said to myself, they all had this sweet radiance that comes from the fact that they know they're nothing and they're infinitely loved. He says, I mean, from this point of view, it is so important to realize that humility is a virtue that we can only gain on a supernatural level. There is no comparison on them. The natural level, you can say modesty. But I mean, modesty is a sort of realization of my limits. If I say to myself, I'm not a Beethoven, and I'm not a Schubert, and I'm not a Goethe, I'm not a Van Eyck, I'm not this and this and this and this, I'll be so incredibly foolish. I'm not saying so that I'll be ridiculous simply. I mean, if I say, I'm going to tell you another thing which happened in my classroom, and the fact that I talk about my past in Hunter suddenly makes me remember things that are sometimes so pathetic. The last course that I gave before I retired was, believe it or not, on love. And I always wanted to do so, and my chairman systematically opposed it because he knew full well.
I was going to say, I can't imagine the Hunter catalog listing a course in love.
Love.
They must have all thought it was about sex.
No, well, you see, because he suspected that I was going to give a sort of, instead of speaking about Freud and so on. Well, I was leaving on the day of registration. After an hour, the place was packed. And there were students, I think I had 45 students, and the class could take, and then several people asked me to stand in the classroom. And I did something incredibly daring, because I'm a little bit daring, and I started to speak about natural love, and I ended my course by speaking about supernatural love. And, and in order to illustrate the point, I made a reference to Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who chose poverty and misery and the slums and the stench of Calcutta out of love, because she loved Christ and so on and so on. And then I said, these are things that can only be achieved with God's help. I spoke very openly about God and so on and so on. And I read final term papers. And I had a fellow, never said anything in the classroom, but I knew who he was. And he said, that was a beautiful course. I cannot thank you enough for it. There was only one flaw, and I want to mention it to you because now you're retiring and so on and so on. You said, this type of love is extremely rare. You are mistaken. I'm just like Mother Teresa of Calcutta. I love everybody. My heart is open to the whole world. I mean, he was divorced, and apart from that, he had a few other weaknesses.
Other than that,
but there was something so pathetic about this unbelief. He was sincerely convinced.
It's very easy. It's much easier to love everybody than to love the man next to you.
The next door neighbor. You remember in Bleak House in Dickens?
Oh yes.
Mrs. Jellyby.
Mrs. Jellyby.
And Mrs. Jellyby
interested in Boya Bulaga, while her children were going to rack and ruin them.
Unwashed and unfed, and the poor husband is in trouble. And she's
writing letters.
It's so absolutely superb. You see that we can live in such illusions when we believe that we are great lovers. My husband said so beautifully, let me repeat this emphatically, the only absolute love is a partaking of Christ's love for another person. Because by myself, I have to acknowledge, I'm too narrow, I'm too mediocre, I'm too imperfect truly to love.
You know, I wonder whether it could be said, I suspect, I'd have to read the chapter again, but I suspect your husband says it in so many words, whether the characteristic focus of love is, and ergo, a fortiori, humility, is out there. The characteristic posture of a profoundly believing Christian, of a pious Catholic, is there, you know, looking at the crucifix, looking at the Blessed Sacrament, looking at caring for the neighbor, like Mother Teresa, in the Rosary, you know, conjuring 15 different scenes that are out there. These are all exercises which, in one sense, shift my center of interest from me.
Always away from myself as a response to value. And simultaneously, the moment when I make an examination of conscience, then I do the opposite. And then I have to look at myself. And but today, you know, because of the passion that we have developed for psychiatry and psychology, the danger is to keep observing myself all the time.
As though the ultimate question is, who am I? And it seems to me that's the penultimate question, but the ultimate question is, who art thou?
And, you know, and it is precisely against the background of who art thou that I discover my true self.
Yes.
You know, and
there's another paradox.
Of course, St. Augustine says, God is closer to me than I am to myself. And in the Confession, which is the book of books, I mean, my husband always said the greatest book after the Bible, you know, he said, you were there, and I was outside of myself, and you only discover your true self in humility, on your knees in front of God.
Thank you for being with us in our conversation with Dr. Alice von Hildebrand concerning the work of her husband, Dietrich von Hildebrand, A Night for Truth.